You know that feeling. You meet someone new, and boom, like almost instantly, maybe in just 100 milliseconds, your brain makes a call. No, trustworthy, not trustworthy, smart. It just happens based on how they look. Feels totally natural, maybe even, unavoidable sometimes. A human shortcut.
It really is fascinating. That speed, it's incredibly efficient for, well, navigating social situations right off the bat. Picking up on identity, gender, age, definitely emotions and faces. Our visual system is just highly tuned for that stuff.
Exactly. But here's where that natural human thing gets really complicated and maybe even harmful. Because this deep dive today, it's all about how these ways we judge faces and other things, like how someone walks or talks, are now being built into AI systems.
Precisely. Our sources called this physiognomic AI. Basically, think computer software AI systems that try to infer things about you, your characteristics, capabilities, what your personality might be like, even predicting future social outcomes. And it's based on physical stuff, your face, your voice, your gait, or behavioral cues.
Okay, so it's like taking that human snap judgment habit and putting it on autopilot with tech.
That's the core of it, yeah. And it opens up a whole can of worms, raises some massive questions.
Right, so let's unpack that. Our mission here is to really explore this idea through a few different lenses. We want to look at it from, like, the historical and philosophical angle, then the psychological reasons behind it, and definitely the social impact. See how each lens sees physiognomic AI differently, and importantly, where these views connect or maybe even clash. We've pulled all this from a stack of sources really digging into this topic.
And what's really striking, starting with that historical view, is that this isn't some brand new concept. Not at all. Physiognomic AI actually draws a pretty direct line back to old practices like physiognomy and phrenology.
Yeah. I remember reading about those. Physiognomy judging character from faces. And phrenology, the bumps on your head telling your personality. Total pseudoscience.
Exactly. Discredited. And for very good reasons. They lacked any real scientific basis. And worse, were often used to justify some pretty awful discrimination. So the big philosophical question here is, when we build AI that does similar things, even if we say it's for social good, are we actually innovating, or are we just dressing up that same old fundamentally suspect idea in fancy new tech? Repeating history, essentially. It's still using how someone looks or acts to guess what's inside or what they'll do next.
So to be clear, any computer system using AI to categorize people or make guesses about them based on physical traits, face, walk, voice, maybe even heart rate, falls under this physiognomic AI umbrella.
According to the sources, yes, that's the broad working definition. It goes beyond just identifying a face, like standard facial recognition. It's about inferring traits from those features.
Okay, now shifting lenses.
Yeah.
Let's look at the psychological side. Why are those human judgments so fast and powerful anyway? And crucially, how do AI systems learn to copy them or maybe even make them worse? You mentioned 100 milliseconds, which is incredibly fast. How does the brain even do that?
Well, research points to this concept psychologists call face overgeneralization. Our brains are obviously wired to pick up important social signals, especially emotions, but the system seems maybe a bit too sensitive.
Overgeneralization. So like taking a tiny hint and blowing it out of proportion.
That's the idea. There's this emotion over generalization hypothesis.
Yeah.
It suggests our brains are so keen on spotting emotions that we start seeing emotional traits like trustworthiness or dominance in totally neutral faces, just because they structurally resemble an emotional expression, even slightly.
So if someone's resting face just happens to have lips that curve down a tiny bit, our brain might flash anger and then jump to thinking dominant or untrustworthy.
That's basically it. And conversely, a neutral face that maybe looks a bit like a smile might get tagged as trustworthy. Beyond just emotion lookalikes, other things matter too. Like baby-facedness features resembling a baby's can trigger protective feelings. And facial symmetry, which is often linked to attractiveness judgments. These also really shape our first impressions. And of course, basic demographic perceptions, gender, age, race, these are also significant predictors of the kinds of impressions people form.
Yeah, I remember seeing in the sources that some stuff you might think would be a big deal, like the facial width to height ratio that people talk about sometimes, actually turned out to be less predictive of whether someone seems trustworthy or dominant compared to things like emotion resemblance or even just gender perception. So it's really those cues our brains are sort of primed for hints of emotion, basic categories that drive these instant judgments.
And this is where the psychology becomes absolutely critical for understanding the AI part. Machine learning systems, they learn from data, huge amounts of it. If that data is full of human judgments or reflects real-world outcomes shaped by our biased first impressions, Like, who gets hired based on an interview impression, who seems trustworthy at first glance. Then the AI trained on it, it's going to absorb those same biased overgeneralizations.
Right. It's like the biases get laundered through the algorithm, doesn't it? They
Yeah.
go in as maybe unconscious human shortcuts, and they come out looking like objective, data-driven facts.
That's a perfect way to put it, laundered. And this leads us straight into the social impact dimension. Because when these psychological biases, turbocharged by technology, are actually deployed out there in the real world, the consequences can be really serious. We already know that appearance-based judgments affect people's lives, right? Studies link certain facial features to getting hired for leadership roles, winning elections, even getting acquitted in court.
So humans are already doing this, making biased judgments. What happens when AI starts doing it systematically at scale?
Well, that's where physiognomic AI becomes a huge social issue. Take hiring, for instance. Some companies have used AI to analyze video interviews, looking at how candidates talk, their behavior, and sometimes, previously at least, their facial expressions. iReview is a well-known example. They moved away from facial analysis specifically, but still analyze other cues.
And I remember during the pandemic, those remote proctoring systems in schools. Using AI to watch students during tests, analyzing behavior, maybe even biometrics, trying to detect cheating, or even just if a student's paying attention, that caused a massive outcry, didn't it?
A huge outcry, yes. And maybe the most disturbing examples our sources point to involve AI software that claims it can predict things like criminality or how dangerous someone might be just based on their facial features, which is terrifyingly close to that phrenology stuff. And it echoes other research showing, for example, that jurors are more likely to give the death penalty to defendants who are perceived as untrustworthy looking, based purely on appearance.
Wow. So these systems aren't just reflecting the biases we already have. You're saying they can actually bring back those old, discredited, often racist pseudosciences and end up perpetuating discrimination, especially against already marginalized groups.
That's a major finding highlighted in the sources, yes. By learning from data steeped in biased human judgments or societal outcomes, these AI systems can embed and reinforce stereotypes. Stereotypes about race, gender, other characteristics. And they make that discrimination look like an objective result from a machine. You even see it in less critical areas, like dating apps using facial analysis to match people, or social media filters that categorize users based on appearance. It sort of normalizes judging people this way.
Okay, so we've got the dodgy historical roots, the flawed psychology of human judgment, and now these really serious social consequences when tech gets involved. Which brings us squarely to the clashes and overlaps, especially when we look at policy and philosophy. This sounds like a nightmare to regulate.
It's incredibly difficult, and one huge hurdle is just defining what we're even talking about. What counts as physiognomic AI? Tech companies can, and sometimes do, exploit this fuzziness. They might push for really narrow definitions and regulations. For example, trying to limit rules to only cover identifying faces, facial recognition for ID, but excluding systems that interpret faces or behavior, analyzing emotions, inferring personality traits, trying to keep those outside the scope of the rules.
So they'd be okay with regulating tech that knows who you are, but they want to pass on tech that judges what you're supposedly like based on how you look or act.
That's often the strategy, yes. The sources mention legislative debates, like in Washington state, where exactly this kind of thing happened. Industry groups arguing for narrow definitions that wouldn't cover many of these problematic trade inference applications. For regulation to actually work, it probably needs to capture that broader concept, inferring internal states or future behavior from external appearance or measurable actions, regardless of the specific tech used.
But despite those tactics, there are pushes to regulate this stuff, right?
Oh, definitely. We're seeing lots of efforts, local, state, even federal level in the U.S. trying to ban or at least restrict government use of facial recognition tech. And in Europe, the big EU AI Act proposal includes outright bans on certain high-risk uses, things like biometric categorization based on sensitive attributes, race, gender, political beliefs. And there are growing calls for even broader bans, like prohibiting automated recognition of any human features, faces, gait, voice, and public spaces altogether.
But you can bet the companies making money from these systems are pushing back hard, arguing regulation kills innovation, maybe saying, oh, just give us more data, we can fix the bias problem.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is where that philosophical clash becomes really sharp, as laid out in the sources. The counter-argument is pretty direct. Some types of innovation are simply not worth pursuing. especially if they're built on foundations of discredited, discriminatory pseudoscience. This philosophical view really questions whether sacrificing fairness and human dignity for profit or perceived efficiency is ever acceptable. And it challenges the whole underlying idea that complex human beings are character, potential future actions can be accurately measured and predicted just from external signals. That's a deeply problematic assumption. Plus, the more data argument. Critics say that just doubles down on the flawed premise and essentially argues for more and more surveillance.
So it goes way beyond just a technical debate about code and data. It's really a fundamental battle over values, isn't it? About what kind of society we want and what limits we need to place on technology to protect basic human rights and dignity.
That's exactly it.
So when we try to bring all these different dimensions together, the historical, the psychological, the social, the philosophical, how do they really connect and where do the tensions lie?
Well, you see a kind of chain reaction almost. The psychological part are built-in biases, that tendency to overgeneralize from appearance that creates the fertile ground. Then technology steps in, amplifying that human impulse. That's the social dimension deploying physiognomic AI in the real world. And that deployment immediately triggers these fundamental philosophical questions about fairness, knowledge, what it means to be human, and how we should treat each other.
Okay, so the clash often seems to be between that deep-seated, maybe even subconscious psychological urge to judge based on looks, and the growing pushback against the very real social harms and discrimination that result, which then forces this deeper philosophical and ethical reckoning.
That sums it up really well. The psychology fuels the tech development and social use, but the harmful consequences create resistance, forcing us to ask those tough ethical questions about whether we should be doing this at all. And the overlap, it's that persistent, stubborn impulse, whether it's happening inside our own heads or coded into an algorithm to believe that the outside somehow directly reflects the inside. That appearance equals truth, or behavior equals fixed character. And technology is making that connection, that equation, much more powerful and potentially dangerous.
It's a really powerful and maybe dangerous feedback loop.
It certainly can be.
So we've taken quite a journey in this deep dive. We've gone from those old, discredited ideas like physiognomy through the lightning-fast biased judgments happening in our own brains. We've explored the real-world social fallout when these biases get embedded in technology. And we've wrestled with the tough policy and philosophical arguments around physiognomic AI.
And I think the key takeaway really is that physiognomic AI isn't just some abstract tech issue about faces and code. It's deeply tangled up with fundamental human psychology, our biases. It raises profound philosophical questions about measurement, fairness, and what's knowable about people. And critically, it has significant documented social consequences, often reinforcing discrimination in really important areas like jobs, education, and the justice system.
Which leaves us with a final thought, really directed at you listening right now. Given that our own brains seem kind of wired for these quick, potentially flawed judgments based on appearance, and now AI is learning these same tendencies from us, from the data reflecting our world, what responsibility do you have? A responsibility to question these judgments, not just the snap judgments you make about others, but also the judgments increasingly being made about you by algorithms that influence your life. How can we as individuals and as a society actively push back against this powerful urge, both the human one and the algorithmic one, to evaluate people based on surface signals instead of digging deeper for substance?